Hello, how's it going? In today's video, the emergence of Cthulhu and the gates of Ahn'Qiraj from Chronicle Volume 3. So let's get... In a nutshell, Vanilla WoW can be summarised as the old gods were playing silly buggers across the world. Everybody could feel the chaos, but nobody knew what was causing it. The Emerald Nightmare was only a symptom of the old gods' growing power, and it was also only a fraction of the shit they'd be capable of if they were released from prison. So it was in most people's interests to stop that from happening. Whilst the Horde and the Alliance, but mainly the Horde, had been fighting to protect the world, Cho'Gall and the Twilight's Hammer cult had been working to bring about the Hour of Twilight, which is the end of all things. They were currently in the desert of Silithus, which was home to the ancient city of Ahn'Qiraj. Cthulhu was imprisoned deep within, but Cho'Gall had no way to reach the old god, because there was an enchanted barrier known as the Scarab Wall standing between him and his master. This barrier had been put in place a while ago by night elves and dragons to contain the insectoid twats called Silithids and Kiraji that had been swarming out of the ancient city. But unlike normal walls, you couldn't fly over the Scarab Wall or tunnel under it. It was magic and special. But Cho'Gall didn't give a shit. He and his followers performed a great ritual. Their magic extended beyond the barrier and pierced the prison chamber holding Cthulhu, and the old god's chains were shattered. The energy unleashed by this ritual was pretty catastrophic for Cho'Gall's cultists. Before they could celebrate, most of them just bloody exploded, and the few that were left were catatonic, complete vegetables that couldn't move or speak. And Cho'Gall was like, "Sucks to be you," and he abandoned them in the desert, because he's a nice bloke. Now that Cthulhu was free of its bonds, Cho'Gall buggered off. He had other old gods to release. But before he left, Cthulhu did whisper, "You might want to recruit more members for the cult, mate, because the other ones exploded." The idea was that the cult would eventually cover every corner of Azeroth, infiltrating each city, guild and faction like an unseen plague. And then, when the time was right, they could rise up and Hour of Twilight that bitch. Cthulhu also made preparations of his own. There were thousands of Kiraji and Silithid laying dormant in Ahn'Qiraj, remnants of the Black Empire forged by the blood of the old gods. So he woke them up and rallied them for war. However, the disturbance at Ahn'Qiraj didn't go unnoticed, mainly because druid outposts in Silithus suddenly found themselves under attack by swarms of insectoids. Both the Horde and the Alliance received their desperate cries for help and immediately sent aid, and soon the truth behind this aggression was revealed by the Bronze Dragonflight. Ahn'Qiraj, a dragon who'd fought in the War of the Shifting Sands centuries ago, could sense that Cthulhu was awake. Only that old god jerk could have launched such a war against Azeroth. The good news was that this was just a sliver of Cthulhu's potential. It had been imprisoned for too long and still needed time to gather its full strength. So we should probably do something, sooner rather than later, because if Cthulhu does reach its full potential, we're screwed! War Chief Thrall and Regent Lord Bolvar Fordragon, who was acting on behalf of Anduin Wrynn, because he's still a little weedy baby boy, came to an agreement. The Horde and the Alliance would work together. Both factions would combine their might and strike back against this massive threat. Varrock Sorfang was put in charge of this campaign. Together, they stood strong against the tides of Kiraji and Silithid, but the insectoids seemed to be infinite in number. Eventually, the Horde and the Alliance were just going to run out of people. The only option was to take the fight to Ahn'Qiraj and strike Cthulhu down. If that was even possible, who bloody knew? But there was no shortage of volunteers. Unfortunately, the Scarab Wall was still a thing, and it was impenetrable, and the only instrument capable of opening it was in pieces, scattered across the world. And so began an extremely long and boring quest chain. Let's do a little montage, because if I do this in real time, this video will be weeks long. First, the champions needed to speak to Anachronos, who'd buggered off back to the Caverns of Time. Second, they went to Blackwing Lair and fought against Broodlord Lashlayer and took his head for some reason. Then, they headed back to Cenarian Hold and were given a special badge, which would allow them to collect Silithid Carapath fragments. And they needed 200 of them. Bloody fantastic. Once they'd handed in enough fragments and gained the trust of the Brood of Nozdormu, they were told to go back to Anachronos in the Caverns of Time. People are actually looking forward to WoW Classic. Then, they reached Anachronos, and he was like, "Oh good, you have neutral reputation with us now. Go back to Silithus for a cutscene." And the champions were like, "Are you taking the piss?" Then, they saw the cutscene, and now needed to go back to Anachronos again. Seriously, this is what WoW Classic is going to be like. And then, Anachronos informed the champions they needed 3 dragon shards. A green one, a red one, and a blue one. I'm not going to go into detail about how you get the 3 shards, but trust me when I say, it takes bloody ages. And once the heroes had collected all the shards, they returned to Anachronos, and he was like, "Great, now you just have to wait for the rest of the server to finish the War Effort Collection quest." At this point, some of the champions were like, "You know what? F this game," and they were never seen again. 5 days after the collection quest was completed, Varrock Sorfang marched the armies to the gates of Ahn'Qiraj and gave the order to bang the gong. This started a 10-hour war server event, where bloody endless insectoids flew out of the temple. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the Scarab Wall was brought down. Does it make sense? No, it doesn't. Who cares? Once the server event was over, Varrock didn't waste any time. He ordered a dual strike upon Cthulhu's forces. The first attack would raid the ruins of Ahn'Qiraj and face the bulk of the insectoid army. They were going to show no mercy, so he deployed his most elite Horde champions. Only they could endure such a brutal battle. Meanwhile, the second attack would storm beneath Ahn'Qiraj, and I guess the Alliance can give that a try. They wouldn't have to fight swarms of insectoids, but they would face Cthulhu's most powerful minions, and then the Old God itself. So I guess the Horde got credit for everything else in vanilla, because the Alliance got to kill an Old God. Well done, 12-year-olds. So, the Horde champions in the ruins of Ahn'Qiraj basically just faced a buttload of insectoids and gained themselves some useless bug mounts. But they did end up fighting against a bloody great Anubisath called Assyrian, who'd survived the War of the Shifting Sands. There were crystals dotted around the room, and activating them put a 45-second debuff on the boss man. So the raid group's strategy was to always position themselves between the boss and the next crystal. Every now and then, Assyrian would do an AoE knockback ability, which actually pushed the raid group closer to the next crystal. So he's a bit of an idiot. Whilst the fight was taking place, a champion would act as a scout and locate the next crystal, and then click their minimap, so the rest of the group knew where the balls to go, and the tanks would then kite Assyrian over to that place. Also, the DPS needed to watch their aggro, because Assyrian is immune to taunt, so they just didn't do any DPS to start off with until the tanks had generated enough hate. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. The Anubisath died, big whoops. Meanwhile, the Alliance weren't having such a great time. Cthulhu was messing with their minds, and they were tripping balls, man, and turning on each other. They'd already fought their way through Anubisath, insectoids, a bloody great sandworm, and a big glob of goo that needed to be frozen before they could damage it. Which is totally a skippable fight, but they did it anyway, because they're completionists. But no one cares about any of those bosses. This is about Cthulhu. Firstly, the Alliance champions decided it was probably not a good idea to all run into the Vault of Cthulhu at the same time. And they were right, because if they'd done that, they'd have probably wiped from Cthulhu's eye-beam. It was bloody difficult to just get into position in the first place for this fight, but they'd prepared and stocked up on nature resistance stuff for the Old God's green beam. Cthulhu also sometimes turned red and started rotating a red beam around the room that does shadow damage. But this group knew to just not stand in the way of that. Not only did they have all this to worry about, but Cthulhu also spawned tentacle ads. Every 45 seconds, there'd be 8 eye tentacles that would do knockbacks and stuff, as well as randomly spawned claw tentacles, which also did knockbacks and stuff, as well as shit damage. And some of the champions were like, Jesus Christ, there's too many things to worry about. This is giving me a seizure. When they reached phase 2, they suddenly realised they were doing hardly any damage to Cthulhu, because it had a shield now. And more tentacles would randomly spawn and swallow a champion. But they soon figured out that being swallowed would allow them to damage Cthulhu from inside its stomach, as long as they didn't stand in the green water, which is stomach acid. And it's never a good idea to stand in stomach acid. Everybody knows that. But eventually, Cthulhu fell. Through blade, shield and magic, an Old God was defeated. Most people didn't even realise the sheer magnitude of this victory. Even the dragon aspects were like, big whoops. How dangerous could it have been if the Alliance did it? This triumph of Azeroth's defenders was a warning to the Old Gods. When we work together, we can beat you, you bunch of dicks. And we're leaving it there! Next Tuesday, Naxxramas, the original 40-man raid version. Also some Lich King stuff, and possibly some time travel stuff, with Ronin, Corielstras, and Broxigar. As always, thanks very much to those of you who support the channel as patrons. If anyone would like to support the channel in that way, links in the description. And there's a link to the Discord server in there as well. If you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, all of that bollocks. And all that's left to say is, thanks for watching, and see ya!